My name is Clayton Lineweber. We're going to take some time to go through the Bible, discussing the topic of the heavenly sanctuary. If you would take your Bibles and open them to the book of Hebrews, chapter 8, verse 1. We're going to start right there in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1. It says, "Now the thing which we have spoken, this is the Son. We have such a high priest, who is set on the right hand of the throne of majesty in heaven." If you think about a high priest, you have to go back to the earthly sanctuary to find out who the high priest is. The high priest was somebody who officiated inside the earthly sanctuary, and the high priest was the one who did the work on the Day of Atonement. And this verse is telling us that we have a high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of majesty in heaven. So we're saying that we have a high priest. You look at the earthly sanctuary and you understand what the earthly sanctuary high priest was for and what he did, then you can better appreciate what the high priest in the heavenly sanctuary has to do for us. Now, we haven't established as the heavenly sanctuary. It just says it's set on the right hand of the throne of majesty in heaven. So we know that our high priest is sitting next to God in the throne in heaven. So we'll move to another verse. Let's now look at the book of Ephesians. Look at chapter 1, verse 20. "Now he wrought in Christ when he was raised from the dead, and set him at his own right hand in heavenly places." Again, we have the idea that Christ, after his death, was raised from the dead, is sitting beside God in the heavenly places. It doesn't say heavenly sanctuary yet. And this one didn't say high priest. But we have the connections being made. They're both sitting beside God. And we know the one who died and was raised from the dead was Christ. So, let's move to the next one. This is found in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 2. "A minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man." So now, going back to verse 1, we have a high priest, right, who's sitting on the right hand of God. And now he's a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched and not man. If you think about when God told the children of Israel to make me a sanctuary, that was them pitching the sanctuary. And in that sanctuary is where we had the earthly high priest. Okay? But now we're finding that we have our high priest, not the one in the earthly sanctuary. We have our high priest who's sitting beside God, though he's connected with God very closely, and he's in heavenly places, and we find out he's a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man. So now we get the idea that where Jesus is in a sanctuary. It's not a sanctuary that man has made. So it's not like he's down in the one man has made. No, this is one that the Lord pitched. Okay? Looking at Hebrews again and chapters 8, we're going to continue on in verse 3 and 4. Talk about Jesus, our high priest again. "For every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices." On the earthly sanctuary, they dedicated the priest and the high priest to work inside the sanctuary. And they had gifts they had to offer. The lamb and this sort of thing. They had these gifts to offer. Let's go back to this verse. "Wherefore it is of necessity that this man," remember Jesus became man even though he was God. The man who came and died for us. "There's necessity that this man has somewhat also to offer." This high priest that we have, this one was Christ who became man and died in our place. This one has to have something somewhat to offer. Okay, "For if he were on earth, he shall not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law." So Jesus has something to offer, but not in the same sense as the ones on earth. Now the ones on earth, they had the things that they were ordained to do. So we know that the priest, the high priest, they were to offer the gifts, and these gifts were symbols of something greater, and Jesus was that greater one. So when Jesus was on this earth, He was not to be the one offering the gifts. He was not to be the high priest on earth. No, He was the gift that they were offering at this point. And so He is the gift that they're offering, and after He has been the gift, which is the lamb that dies, now He goes to heaven as the high priest. Now He's acting the part of the high priest when He goes to heaven. And the gift that He has to offer was His life for man. Follow me so far? Now let's look at verse 5. Now talking about Jesus the high priest. Talking about those priests that represented Jesus as the high priest. Those priests who served unto the example and shadow of heavenly things. What they were doing was nothing more than a shadow or an example of what was going to take place in heaven. The heavenly things. And so it says, when Moses was admonished of God, when he was about to make the tabernacle, for see, he said, Thou shalt make all things according to the pattern shown thee upon the mountain. So what I want to establish here with you at this point is this, that the earthly sanctuary was a pattern of the heavenly sanctuary. And when they were going to make it, God showed them something that was a real, so they could make the shadow, the pattern of the heavenly sanctuary. The pattern was the earthly sanctuary was nothing more than a model of what the real thing was. And then the priests that were working in the sanctuary, they were the ones that were supposed to act out the work that Christ was going to do when He came to this earth and when He dealing with the heavenly sanctuary. Now the heavenly sanctuary becomes more important to us as we go on. So at this point, we just listen to the verses. We have a high priest who is set beside the Father. And that high priest is in a sanctuary that God has pitched and not man. Okay? If He was the high priest on earth, He would have offered the gifts. But He's not the high priest upon this earth. He came as the gift, the lamb that was going to be representing Christ, representing His death. And then when He goes to heaven, now He is our high priest. He's fulfilled the work that He came to do as the gift that the priest offered in the sanctuary. Now He is our high priest in the heavenly sanctuary. So just that little picture tells you that what the priest was doing in the courtyard and in the holy place, in the most holy place, was acting out the scenes of Christ's life. And we'll get into more detail of that in further lessons. But let's move on just a little bit further. I want you to look at Hebrews 9, verse 11. Okay? Hebrews 9, verse 11, it says this, But Christ, being come a high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands. That is to say, not of this building. So, the earthly sanctuary, they had sanctuaries. All the way down to the time of 70 A.D. And so these sanctuaries, they were acting out the work that Christ was to do. And so here we have that Christ being a better things than the high priests were. Okay? And of the more perfect tabernacle that's not made with hands. It wasn't the one that man made. We're dealing with one that God has made. It's not the one on the earth, but the one in the heavens above. Let's look at another one. And let them make me a sanctuary that I might dwell among them, is what we find there in the book of Exodus 25, verse 8. Now this is when they came out of captivity. This is during the time that God is telling them to build them a sanctuary, is after they crossed the Red Sea. Okay? And then He says, I want you to make them after the pattern that I've shown you. This is in verse 9 of Exodus 25. According to all that I showed thee, after the pattern of the tabernacle, and of the patterns of all the instruments thereof, even so shall you make it. So God's saying, make it exactly like I'm telling you. So we find out that Hebrews chapters 8 and chapters 9, they're dealing with the heavenly sanctuary that was, and we find that the patterns that Moses was built was nothing but more than shadows of the heavenly saints. Let's look at verse 24 of Hebrews 9. For Christ has not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are a figure of the true. but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Now listen to this again. For Christ has not entered into the holy places made with hands. Remember we read that Jesus is sitting in the heavenly places? Okay, beside the Father? Now, so he's saying, if Christ has not entered into the holy places made with hands. Again, he's not talking about the earthly sanctuary, because they are a figure of the true. You see what I'm saying? But into heaven itself. Now he's saying where it is. But into heaven itself. Now to appear in the presence of God for us. So all of these verses in Hebrews 8 and Hebrews 9 are pointing toward the work of that Jesus is doing in the heavenly one, contrasting it from the one that Moses builds in the wilderness as the earthly sanctuary. So understanding the earthly sanctuary will help us understand what he's dealing with in the heavenly sanctuary. So all of these things have become very important to us. As we read on and on in the Bible, we will find that much of the talking of the sanctuary is dealing with the sanctuary in heaven. Let's go on. In Exodus 15, verse 17, this is when they've already built, they've already come out of Egypt. The plagues have already fallen, and they've come across the Red Sea. This is before they come to Mount Sinai, where God says, make me a sanctuary that I might dwell among you. So here's what it says here. They've come across the Red Sea. Now they rejoice. This is called the Song of Moses. But we're only going to read the verse 17 of chapter 15. It says, thou shalt bring them in and plant them in the mountain of thine inheritance, in the place, O Lord, which thou hast made for thee to dwell in the sanctuary, O Lord, which thy hands have established. Now I want you to think about this. This is 10 chapters before the 25th chapter where he says, make me a sanctuary that I might dwell among you. He's already referencing in this song that God is in a sanctuary that his hands have established. So again, we're not talking about an earthly sanctuary. The sanctuary that his hands have established has been before the earthly sanctuary here upon this earth. Because the earthly sanctuary was patterned after another one that God already had. Okay? Let's look at Psalms 102:19. Psalms 102:19 says this, for he hath looked down from the height of his sanctuary from heaven, did the Lord behold the earth. And so, I just want you to see other verses in other parts of the Bible that connect the dots. For he hath looked down from the height of his sanctuary. God's sanctuary, which is in heaven. So the idea is, his heavenly sanctuary, God is at, and he looks down and he beholds the earth. The earth is where he has them build a sanctuary after the pattern that he showed them upon the mountain, and the pattern was the heavenly sanctuary. Look at Psalms 11 verse 4. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. And I like this because that's exactly what we find when we're talking about in the book of Hebrews, chapter 8, and actually chapters 10 too, where the reference is that Jesus went to sit beside the Father there in Ephesians chapters 1 verse 20 as well. He's sitting on the right hand of the Father. The throne is in heaven. And we find that his holy temple is there. So you get the idea that the holy temple is a symbol of where God's throne is at. So of course the heavenly sanctuary is there. The idea that most people gather is that the earthly sanctuary was placed into existence for the purpose of separating the sin from man, and that's why it was put into existence, because they can bring the animals in and they can kill all the animals and separate the sin and the death for all the lambs. But what I want to share with you is this, that we get the idea from this verse, that from these verses we've read, that the sanctuary has already been there. Has been there already from the beginning. And they've already been using it. And the sanctuary, you see, has always been there. It isn't that God is just now making a sanctuary because sin has come in. The heavenly sanctuary is a place where his throne is at. And so now let's move on. Look at Revelation 11 verse 19. And the temple of God was opened in heaven. Now where's the temple at? In heaven. So the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament. Now, it's interesting that in the earthly sanctuary, when they built the earthly sanctuary, that they were told also to have the Ark of the Testimony. So we find that in the heavenly sanctuary, it says, the temple was open, there was the Ark of His testimony. Let's look in Exodus chapter 40, verse 21. And he brought the ark into the tabernacle, and he set up the veil of the covering, and covered the ark of the testimony, as the Lord commanded Moses. So you have here that there was an ark of the testimony in the earthly sanctuary, and there's an ark of the testimony in the heavenly sanctuary. You have in Revelation 11:19 referencing the heavenly sanctuary with the ark of the testimony, and you have Exodus 40 is showing that it was one in the earthly sanctuary. Look at this verse in the Revelation 8, verse 3. Revelation 8:3 says, And another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer. And there was given to him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of the saints, upon the golden altar which was before the throne. So you have a picture now in the heavenly sanctuary. You're talking about there's an angel dealing with the prayers of the saints, and he's got the golden censer before the throne. And we know the throne is in his sanctuary. The sanctuary is in heaven. So we have the idea that in that sanctuary we have a throne. We have the smoke rising. We have the symbol of the altar of incense. Let's look in the Old Testament, found in Exodus 30, verse 1. And also we'll read Exodus 30, verse 6. Now 30, verse 1 says this, And thou shalt make an altar to burn incense upon. And it goes on down in verse 6 and says, And thou shalt put it before the veil that is by the ark of the testimony. You see, in the heavenly sanctuary you have the ark of the testimony. And then you have in the earthly sanctuary ark of the testimony. And before the ark of the testimony you have before the throne. The ark of the testimony is God's place, the sit, His throne. And you have before His throne you have the altar of incense. And you see here in Exodus 30, in the earthly sanctuary, placed before the ark was the altar of incense. What I'm trying to establish with you is here, God gave us a picture of heaven. We can't see heaven, but through the picture of the earthly sanctuary, we'll get to see heaven in the work that's taking place there. So we know that there is a heavenly sanctuary that has the Ark of the Covenant, and there was an earthly sanctuary God said, put the Ark of the Covenant. We know that there's an altar of incense there in Revelation 8:3 in the heavenly sanctuary, and also we know that God says place it there in Exodus 30 verses 1 and 6. And let's look at another one. This is found in Revelation 4 verse 5. And immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat upon the throne. That's Revelation 4:2. And let's read on down to the next verse, verse 5. And out of the throne proceeded lightning and thunderings and voices, and there was 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Do you have another piece of furniture described here in the heavenly sanctuary? Because you have the throne was set in heaven. The throne is in the heavenly sanctuary. We've already established that earlier in the other verses. And we see out of that throne proceeded lightning and thundering, and before that throne was also not just the altar of incense, but there was also lamps burning. And we find in Exodus chapter 26, verse 35. And it says, And thou shalt set the table without the veil. Remember the veil, on the side of the veil is where you have the Ark of the Testimony. And just on the other side of the veil, the Ark of the Testimony, you have where the altar of incense is. Listen what it says. And thou shalt set the table without the veil, the table of showbread. And it goes on to say, And the candlesticks over against the table on the side of the tabernacle toward the south. And thou shalt put the table upon the north. So the picture you have here, you have the God's thrones here. You have the altar of incense here. Then you have in front of that, and before that as well, you have on this side, which is the south side, you have the candlesticks. On this side, you have on the north side, you have the table of showbread. And God has said for them to place it there, exactly where to put it. And then you find in the heavenly sanctuary, it references that there's an Ark of the Covenant. And then you find in the Old Testament, God said put an Ark of the Testimony there. Then you find out there was an altar of incense placed there. And He says to place it there also in the earthly sanctuary. And now you find in Revelation chapter 4 verses 2 and 5 that there's There's 7 lamps burning. There's 7 golden candlesticks before that throne. And again you find it's described that the candlesticks were placed before the throne, there inside the holy place, there in front of the veil, before the veil, in front of the most holy place. So you have all these items there. Now let's look at another verse. Because, we're dealing with the time that they said in the earthly sanctuary, we see it in the heavenly sanctuary. But yet now, what about in the future? Will the heavenly sanctuary exist in the future? Well, it says here in Revelation chapter 14, verse 17. It says this, "And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle." Now, if you read about this time, this is describing the time dealing with the reaping of God's people. The reaping, the sickle, comes out of the temple. Or the reaping, the gathering up those from Satan. The gathering up, with the sickle, throw them into the lake of fire. So all of this is future. So you have here that we're seeing that there's out of the temple of heaven, it's saying. So the temple of heaven has been there. Then you find here that John sees angels coming out of the temple in his vision while he's on the Isle of Patmos. Let's look at another verse. This is found in Revelation chapter 15, verses 5 and 6. And it says, "And I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened. And the 7 angels came out of the temple, having the 7 plagues." The 7 last plagues are coming upon this earth. And the 7 last plagues happen at the end. So you see that the temple in heaven is being used even at this particular time. The heavenly sanctuary. You find in the book of Jeremiah. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 17, chapter 17, verse 12. It references that there's the glorious high throne from the beginning is a place of our tabernacle. I want to tell you about the time that Jesus comes to that earthly sanctuary. Jesus comes to that earthly sanctuary, and there's men selling sheep, oxen, goats, and this sort of thing inside the temple. And is making his temple a loud, noisy place, not a place of worship. And they're taking and they're using his temple as a way in which to make money. People had to travel a long ways. And so when they got there, they would have sheep ready there that they can purchase. But the prices for those sheep were way too high. And people were bickering and arguing over the pricing. And then you have the money. The money itself, the money changers. Your money isn't good enough. You need to buy the temple money. And it costs more than your common money. They were using something that was supposed to represent the death of his son, the gift from heaven. And they were using the opportunity to make money for themselves. And they were doing this, and Jesus sees this. Then he says, "Make not my Father's house a house of merchandise." And he chases out the money changers and those animals. So you get the picture here that God is in the earthly sanctuary. And he calls it his Father's house. And what I like about him calling his Father's house is that we find when Jesus is talking to the disciples before he's going to go to heaven. He's about ready to go to his Father. And he's going to leave them upon this earth. And as he's about ready to leave, he tells the disciples in John chapter 14, "In my Father's house are many mansions." What I want you to realize, that God has his home, just like you have a home. And in your home, you have rooms. You have room for your children. God has his home in heaven. His home is his heavenly sanctuary. And his home has rooms. And he went to prepare a place for you and I. I hope that the idea that there truly is a heavenly sanctuary now piques in your mind to want to study out what we are going to talk about next. You see, the Bible talks about many temples. The first and the original temple is the heavenly sanctuary. But the Bible goes on to speak about other sanctuaries and other temples. When you look at the other temples and how God describes the working that takes place in those temples, you will see that God is using His Son to come to this earth to die for man. That happened already. That's the work that you find that's done in the courtyard. In the heavenly sanctuary, as you study it, you will not find anything referencing, dealing with the courtyard in the heavenly sanctuary. That's what came in because of sin. The sanctuary didn't. It's always been there. It's God's house. See, God never changes. But when sin came in, there needed to be someone to step in and take the place. And that's what Jesus did. When Jesus came and died for you and I, He was that lamb that was slain from the foundation of the world. And Jesus fulfills the work in the courtyard. Then He goes, like it says in Hebrews, when He's finished, to go do the work like the high priest did the work in the sanctuary, where the people could not come. The people would not go into the holy and most holy place. Only the priest would minister there. And so when you're looking at the earthly sanctuary, now you can see the working in which Christ is going to do. That's why I believe it's so important that you and I understand about the sanctuary. Understanding the sanctuary helps us better understand what's taking place in the sanctuary that's in heaven that we cannot go to like the people could not. But our high priest went there for us. And He's there performing the work for you and I right now. God bless until we meet again.